Chapter 1. A fire crackled in the center of the group, a mix of tall and muscular men and the somewhat smaller omegas who sat around it. The warmth didn't reach Philip's cold skin. Hardly anything did anymore. The wise woman spoke with that vampire medium and the cougar-shifter, both standing beside her. James DeWitt's pack had certainly diversified itself in the last year. Philip had to give it that. The sight of many of Philip's former pack mates, most of whom used to answer to him and sit around the fire with their own wise woman, reminded him that he was no longer a leading alpha, which was probably for the best. He'd proved how little he could handle these last couple of months, hadn't he? I have spent many months contemplating this issue, said old Maggie, the wise woman, as she stood in front of the fire. Philip thought that maybe she should back away from it a step or two before that floral sundress of hers stretched over her plump body and the hunch in her back caught fire from being too close or something. Ivan Storm and I are in agreement that this is the only logical reason why so many of our males are finding their mates with other males, females with other females, and alphas with alphas. Philip felt a pair of eyes on him, eyes that had been following him around for the last 4 weeks, ever since he finally returned from his crazed escape into the wilderness. He'd nearly gone wild. Hell, from what James had told him of his behavior, maybe he had been a little wild. Wild werewolves were dangerous and often didn't think in the human sense of the word before they went on the attack. He was fine now. He thought so anyway, but they were still searching for the other werewolf, Luke, a former hunter who had been turned. So far no reports had come in of any animal attacks in the area, and maybe that was the reason why everyone was dragging their feet on the issue, but Philip wanted to end this meeting, get away from those hopeful, glowing hazel eyes that stared at him and go out hunting. So what's causing this? Nick asked. He was blind, and formerly a warrior of Philip's pack before the man made it with one of James's alphas and decided to make this pack his permanent residence. He still treated Philip with a great deal of respect, but he was another reminder of how Philip had failed as a leader. Nick might be blind, but he was the best assassin of hunters that Philip had ever seen. Sometimes he thought that if he just asked the man to come and live in his pack with his mate, then maybe there would have been enough power on Philip's side to properly fight off the hunters. Many of his alphas and omegas would still be alive. So would his wife Helen. Storm, the cougar-shifter with long straight hair that was so blonde it was almost white, cleared his throat. Philip always wondered how he lost his right eye, but he didn't want to ask, though he sometimes couldn't stop himself from staring at the eye patch. I've spoken with my mate about this as well as James, but most of you still don't know what's happening with the cougars. They're making laws now stating that any eligible males or females have to marry of the opposite sex. They've started noticing the numbers in the species dropping, and they're taking action with it. There were some murmurs amongst the alphas sitting around the fire. James was the first to get up to calm everyone's suspicions. The cougars aren't going to start a war with us because we do things here differently than they do. I haven't spoken to anyone from any family of cougars, but as far as I know, there's no bad blood stirring either. No one needs to worry. But what does this have to do with everyone taking same-sex mates? Tristan asked. He was holding the hand of that hunter he'd mated with, a man named Isaac. Well, perhaps former hunter was the proper term for him, and he wasn't the only former hunter in the pack now either, with the new additions of Everett, King and Storm, as well as that kid Chance. Still, Philip preferred to avoid them. He wasn't much up for socializing with any hunters, be they former or otherwise. It's because your numbers are growing too large, Ivan said. For vampires, this happens every couple hundred years or so, we were told. Our numbers get to be too great, and so our women either become barren or every new vampire born grows up to discover they prefer their own sex. Everyone hung on to the vampire's words, even Philip. The thing that vampires and werewolves share is that we can infect a human with our genes, or we can create more by simply breeding. But too many of us threatens our way of life, oddly enough. We can only survive in secrecy, so for us to be finding mates in our own sex is a way for nature to slow down how often we reproduce. Kind of like the plague that wiped out much of the human population in medieval times. Everyone shifted. No one particularly enjoyed having their situation compared to that of a deadly and easily spread disease. So what does this mean? Asked a werewolf by the name of Ryan. Philip Couldn't remember the man's surname, but unless he was getting his stories mixed up, that was the guy who was the former police detective and also mated to a werewolf named Blasius. Blasius walked around talking like he was a Viking or something. Phillip wouldn't be surprised if he actually was, what with the way things were going around here. Phillip had never seen a pack filled with so many odd characters before. Old Maggie answered Ryan's question. He was a former human, as were many of the werewolves in the pack, so they would also be curious as to what this new trend meant. We want to assure everyone that we find nothing out of the ordinary about the way our pack is evolving. It's also possible that other packs are experiencing a similar situation, but how they are handling the matter, we are not sure. Rest assured that regardless of what changes may arise, everyone is still welcome in this pack, and should anyone come to challenge our ways, we will not be docile. Phillip got up and left. He didn't want to hear any more. He was barely 20 feet away from the fire's light and warmth when he heard the soft footfalls behind him. He waited until he was another 50 steps away before he lost his patience entirely, stopped and turned around. Why are you following me? Trevor Knight looked like a deer in the headlights, the poor guy. Did you really think I wouldn't notice you back there? Phillip asked. Trevor clenched his jaw and looked away. He was not originally from DeWitts' pack, nor was he a former member following under Phillip. He was a man who had been forcefully transformed by another werewolf. I just thought you might want some company. What Phillip thought of doing made his body clench up. He hated that he was looking at this man and thinking of the things that he was, especially when he was still in mourning. Christ, not even a year had passed since Helen had. He abruptly stopped that thought before it could go on. He didn't want to think of Helen while fighting off thoughts of Trevor. I left because I didn't want the company, Phillip said, and then he spun on his heel and walked deeper into the woods. The darkness made him feel better. Trevor's running feet crunched in the dry leaves and twigs before his hand grabbed Phillip's shoulder. Trevor was an alpha, so he was fast and silent when he wanted to be, but Phillip hadn't gotten to be a leading alpha by being slower or weaker than the others. He grabbed Trevor by the arms and quickly spun the man around, backing him into the nearest tree. Trevor wasn't scared of him, though, the bastard. He glared at Phillip with as much emotion as Phillip did to him. You heard what they said. This is normal. Why are you fighting it? Because his wife was dead, but she was still alive to him. Because he couldn't let her go and admit to the world that, despite how much he'd loved her, she hadn't been his mate. The man standing in front of him apparently was. No one has to know, Trevor said in a quiet voice. Phillip couldn't believe what he just heard. You would keep something like that a secret? What, are we in high school or something? Don't be a jerk, Trevor shot back. I've been around you for a month now, and I wasn't born a werewolf, but even I can see there's something going on here. Trevor wet his lips, and Phillip felt a twinge of guilt at the way he was blatantly ignoring the man's feelings. I can't take it anymore. I need to touch you. I need to be around you. Can't even sleep at night anymore because all I think about is you. Trevor's face went red when the words left his mouth, and Phillip understood why. He'd been keeping the man awake at night because Trevor had been touching himself while thinking about Phillip. Phillip wasn't about to admit to him that there were times, a lot of times, when he'd done the same. He and Trevor had met shortly after Phillip had been picked up by James DeWitt and his pack. Phillip had basically lost it after Helen had been brutally murdered. He'd gone so far off his rocker that he'd abandoned his pack and his son to the care of James and his mate Corey. He'd spent most of his time in the wilderness, at first preying upon any hunters he could find, then giving up and living in the wild as though he were a real wolf. He'd spent so much time in his wolf skin that he'd almost started to think he was a wolf. He'd nearly become wild. Then he'd come across a pair of hunters torturing another werewolf, while the guy's mate watched no less. Phillip had wanted to die, but the sight of hunters, even the smell of them, always sent him off. He took care of them quickly and then was sent to get help from James DeWitt. He'd basically been forced to return to normal life. As normal as could be expected for a werewolf, that is. That wasn't the first time he'd ever laid eyes on Trevor Knight. That had happened after Helen had been taken. He'd barely noticed Trevor then and had forgotten all about him. It wasn't until Phillip was brought into DeWitt's pack that he'd seen him again and really noticed him. He couldn't describe the feelings that went through him. He would have to be a writer or a poet for that to have been possible. It was almost like the day he met Helen, only stronger. At least 10 times stronger. Trevor had the most beautiful eyes Phillip had ever seen. Helen had lovely eyes. They had been a shade of blue that only appeared in the morning when the sun rose, but Trevor's were something else entirely. They were such a bright golden hazel that it was almost like looking into the golden eyes of a transformed werewolf. His hair was bright blonde and framed a face so perfect. Phillip doubted the man had ever seen any sort of hardship in his life before. Being attacked and turned into a werewolf against his will, that is. He looked like he could be a model in a magazine or something. Phillip did not. He was 66 years old, and while werewolves aged slower than humans did, he still looked older than Trevor's age at 23. Making friends with the man that Phillip fantasized about at night was a mistake. Coming to this pack was a mistake, but he couldn't leave now. His memory might have gotten a little fucked up after he nearly went wild, but his son was alive and here, being raised by James and Corey. Sammy wasn't going to be one for another 2 weeks or so, but Phillip had been shocked to realize that the boy hadn't recognized him at all. He'd forgotten his father in all the time Phillip had been away. Phillip couldn't leave again. "I know you were married to a woman before," Trevor said gently, and Phillip noticed the way he didn't use her name while they were as close as this. "But you can't deny that this is starting to affect you negatively too." He was right. Of course. Phillip was becoming angry at everyone and everything. He couldn't sleep most nights, and people were beginning to notice his change in moods. "So your proposal is that we do this on the side so no one notices?" The idea sounded so cheap, and he hated the fact that it appealed to him. He really was scum. Trevor nodded. "You're not gay. I get that. I'll take you any way I can get. You can top me, and I won't say a word about it to anyone, just please." Trevor's grip on Phillip's arm softened as they slid up to his shoulders. That ever-hopeful look in his golden eyes was back, and Phillip could no longer say no. He fists his hands into that perfect hair and yanked Trevor's face forward for a kiss. Chapter 4. They hadn't exactly set the date when their movie night would be, but Phillip wasn't about to put it off. He wasn't going to act like a child about this and ignore the man just to get out of spending time with him. He went into town that day, pulling out his wallet for the first time in months, and was pleased to note that when he stuck his card in the ATM he was able to take out some cash. At least the bank had been well taken care of while he was away. Brampton was a small town. Its main shopping road was also where many of the residents lived. They lived in the apartments above their shops or slightly farther into town. Either way, it should have everything he needed. Werewolves weren't often permitted to go into town for long periods of time. It was always better that the townsfolk knew as little as possible about the people who lived in the cottages 20 minutes down the highway, but there were always things that needed to be done that couldn't be put off. Working, for one thing. Some of James DeWitts' alphas worked under the table for the citizens of Brampton, moving heavy objects, gardening, and lately even small construction projects. Then there was also buying food and clothing and other necessitates, but Phillip wasn't here for any of those reasons. He hadn't even asked for permission to come into town. He wasn't about to ask for it either. He wasn't one of James's alphas, no matter how much he appreciated the help of the man, and he was feeling more than capable of going into the only gas station in town to buy some microwave popcorn. That, and the first birthday of his son was drawing closer and closer. He was going to have to get him a gift. Sammy wouldn't remember the day no matter what Phillip got him, but Phillip would remember it. He swore to himself that he was never going to allow himself to forget it or his son. He just wished he had Helen here with him so she could help him pick something out. He never had been good at shopping. She hadn't been much for it either. But then he remembered things suddenly appearing in their house. The crib, rocker, stuffed animals, clothes, and even a baby monitor, despite the fact that they both had excellent hearing and wouldn't have needed the thing. Phillip picked up 2 boxes of popcorn, 2 bags of chips, and 2 of the big bottles of soda. That should be enough for the both of them to get through a couple of movies on. He was a little surprised to see that they were also selling bottles of lube next to the condoms, and he tried not to be too embarrassed when he asked the cashier to add it to his purchase. Trevor shouldn't be the only one to be thinking of things like that. The pimply-faced kid just grinned at him as he rang through the purchase. Phillip quickly left after that. Next he made his way over to the thrift store. There wasn't exactly a shopping mall in Brampton, so this was where most people got their clothes from after they got sick of the stuff they'd ordered online. He went inside and found plenty of nice-looking clothes for Sammy to wear. Many that looked to be in almost new condition despite the fact that they were donations. One of the ladies behind the counter had even taken a shine to him when he asked which clothes would best fit a 1-year-old. "Oh, for your boy." Her face became flushed as she asked, looking at the clothes with dinosaurs and baseballs that Phillip was holding in his hand. "Yeah, not so good with this really." "That's all right. Your wife usually does the shopping." He caught the way she asked him, looking him over curiously once more as she led him back to the baby aisle. She was scoping him out. She probably had a toddler or two of her own back at her house. She used to. And that was all he was going to say on the matter. The blonde woman actually took him by the arm and started showing him one by one each garment of clothing, which would look the cutest, be the warmest, most comfortable, best for his dollar, and so on and so on. She really was too eager to help him out. He eyed her figure when she turned around. Wide hips that were good for childbearing and large breasts that tested the boundaries of the buttons on her blouse. This woman definitely had some children of her own. Then he got it. It was the single father thing. He'd seen it before in movies and on television but didn't think it was real. Single mothers were attracted to single fathers like nobody's business, and this woman was totally into him. He allowed her to help him out, doing his best to keep his face on neutral, but the entire time he was looking at her and wondering why he wasn't reacting to her subtle advances. She was a woman and he still liked women as far as he knew, and she was pretty enough. She looked to be about 30 or so. That was still less than half his age, but 30 was definitely more appropriate than 23. Maybe it was the fact that she was wearing too much perfume that was throwing him off. Whatever the case was, he wasn't feeling any kind of physical or emotional reaction to her. Maybe it was the fact that he'd made it. Yeah, that had to be. "Is there anything else you'll be needing help with?" the woman asked. Sometime during all her helpful babbling she'd offered her name, but Phillip was slightly ashamed to admit that he couldn't quite remember it. "No, I think I'm fine," he said. He'd picked out the clothes he wanted and the baby toys that she had assured him were appropriate for a 1-year-old. He figured he would go to the library next and see if they had any picture books in their discard piles. Sammy was starting to learn words now, so those would be a good idea. "Well then, let me take you back up to the front cash register." With a smile and a wiggle of her hips, the sales clerk led Phillip back to the front. On the way, he passed by another shelf filled with books. Not children's books like he wanted, but there was one in particular that caught his eye. Dracula. That was a coincidence. "Found something else, sweetie?" "Yeah, I think so," Phillip said and added the book to his pile of items. The woman rang him through and bagged his items with what had to have been the happiest smile on her face ever. She also picked a card up off the counter and handed it to him. He didn't even know that people who worked in thrift stores had their own cards printed out. Maybe she was the manager. "Give me a call if you happen to need any more help," she said. He quickly looked at the card. Nancy was the name written on it. "I'll do that," he said, and then walked out the door with Nancy happily waving behind him. He walked down the street a bit, waiting until he was far enough away from the shop windows so that she wouldn't see him quickly toss the little card with all the numbers on it into the garbage bin. He already had a date. Eric watched Phillip wander into the library next. The man seemed so caught up in whatever he was doing that he wasn't even aware of the fact that he was being watched. "You think we should tell James about this?" Eric, Eli's twin brother, asked. No one who looked at either of them would know they were twins, however, ever since Eric had been killed, mated with a vampire, and then developed the ability to take over that vampire's body. Well, they both looked different. It was a long story. "I guess so. I mean, I hadn't heard he was coming to town, but he doesn't look like he's hurting anything." "I think he's just shopping," Eli said. Eric scratched at his chin. "Yeah, I guess so. Heard it was his kid's birthday coming up. Maybe all the snacks are for a party. Maybe there are a couple of younger pups in the pack that would still be young enough for a 1-year-old's birthday. If that's what they're for." He really didn't grab enough, though. "Agreed. I still remember the time when John ate the entire bag of Halloween candy he'd collected in one night." "In an hour," Eric said. Eli nodded and then he laughed. The stupid little bastard made himself so sick. Eric smiled at his brother. It was nice being able to hang out with him like this. He had to possess Ivan's body to do it, with Ivan's permission, of course, but now they were able to have a relationship again. The fun thing was that while he was in this body, Ivan's vampire nature seemed to go dormant. The sun didn't burn his skin while Eric was in the driver's seat, and he could even transform into a wolf, and all the while Ivan's spirit slept peacefully deep inside the body. It was still odd for him to look in the mirror and see a face that wasn't his own. That part still threw him off. So we're at least going to ask James about this? Eric asked, confirming what they both already knew had to be done. Eric shrugged. Might as well. At the very least we should ask him if he knows anything about that woman. What woman? Eli asked, looking toward the library where Phillip was still inside. You talking about the lady in the thrift store? They'd both been able to sneak up to the front windows and quickly peek inside, while Phillip had run through his purchases, but Eric hadn't been talking about her. She's right there, standing by the doors. The brunette. Dude, there's no one there. What the hell are you? With stunning clarity, Eric realized what he was looking at. Oh shit. What? What is it? Eli asked. Eric was going to have to ask Phillip some questions before it was confirmed, but there was only one explanation as to why a female ghost would be following the man around. I think I see Phillip's dead. Chapter 6. They held each other, just talking quietly for a while. The sexual mood had pretty much been killed by the subject matter, but for the moment they were enjoying each other's company, as well as the feeling of just having another person there in the room. Phillip had to admit that he enjoyed it. He wasn't in love with Trevor, he didn't think he was, but at the moment he knew he could easily slip into that emotion and be perfectly content. Someone broke their peaceful atmosphere by knocking on the front door. They both sat up suddenly. Phillip looked at Trevor as he got out of bed and started putting on a clean set of clothes. Would your roommates knock? I doubt it, Trevor said, then went down the hall to answer the door. Phillip thought he should get up as well. It didn't look like they would be going back to bed together tonight. It was a little disappointing, but he could handle it now that he'd had the other man. At least he wouldn't be spending all night awake fighting off his lust. Phillip heard Trevor speaking to someone as he shimmied into his jeans. He was pretty sure it wasn't James at the door. He would have knocked once and then entered, as was his right in a pack that he was the leader of. Oddly enough, he couldn't tell who was at the door. His nose seemed to be failing him on that one. Maybe the scent of sex was so heavy that it was blocking the outside. Trevor's voice got a little louder, and though Phillip couldn't smell the person approaching, he could hear the heavy clomp of booted feet against the floor as they came closer to Trevor's door. There wasn't anywhere for Phillip to run and hide, and he wasn't about to do that anyway. Whoever was coming, he was going to face them head on. The door opened, revealing the pale face of the vampire Ivan, only his eyes weren't red today. That must mean that the spirit of his werewolf protector Eric was inside of him. Phillip frowned at the sight of the man. He was pretty sure there was nothing going on between Trevor and Eric, or Ivan, whoever that would cause the other man to burst into the room like this, like a jealous lover. What do you want? Phillip demanded. His inner alpha was still pretty damn offended at the intrusion, regardless of what it was for. Eric's eyes fell onto a chair in the corner next to the closet. He stared there for a full 60 seconds, and that was a long time. By the time he snapped out of it and looked back at Phillip, Trevor had come back into the room and was giving Phillip an apologetic look for allowing Eric to pass him. Eric, or Ivan, whoever, what are you doing here? Phillip demanded again. Eric sighed at the sight of him, and he cast a quick and pitying look at Trevor. Phillip, I need to speak with you real quick. Phillip folded his arms. All right. Speak. Eric waited a second, still casting doubting looks to Trevor. Alone would be best. Phillip wasn't about to have any of that. Not until he knew what this was about. Is this because I left the pack land without permission? No point in pretending he hadn't. Regardless of whether or not the man in front of him had known Phillip had left, Phillip knew someone would confront him with it eventually. Might as well be now. Eric's jaw clenched slightly. No. I saw you, but I haven't told James about yet. I don't think he'll do much about it anyway. He respects you enough to let the offense slide. Then what is this about? I'm with someone. He noted the way Trevor seemed to brighten up proudly at Philip's words. Do you really want me talking about your mate in front of your lover? Eric asked, though the words weren't biting. Philip's entire face went cold, and his eyes went wide. Just come with me. Old Maggie and James are at the pond. We need to tell you something. Show you something, really? Eric turned around without another word. He walked out of the bedroom and down the hall to the front door. Like he was being led by his nose, Philip followed him. Something about his wife. There was some news about Helen that he needed to hear. Trevor watched both men leave, and he tried his absolute best to keep everything inside of him from imploding with curiosity and anger. Philip was clearly ready to let the pack know that he and Trevor were together, kind of, but he was still willing to let other people think that he was just a lover instead of a mate. He'd almost corrected Eric when he spoke, but he kept his mouth shut out of respect for Philip's wishes. He was going to give the guy the benefit of the doubt, even though he wanted nothing better than to follow the both of them to the pond and find out whatever it was that they knew about Philip's deceased wife. He sat on his bed and decided to wait it out instead. They brought him deep into the woods. Night had fallen some hours ago, and so everything was dark and cold, but Philip could see just fine as Eric led him farther in. Soon, Philip heard the trickle of water from the little waterfall that fed the pond and smelled the water as well as the plant life that grew inside of it. He'd been here a couple of times already to drink from the water. It had some kind of mysterious healing powers, and he had to admit that when he drank from the water while recovering from his time as a wild werewolf, he did feel better and more in control of himself. Old Maggie was indeed waiting there. She had on a red sundress today with a rose pattern, and the large hump in her back was somewhat hidden away by the wide scarf tied around her neck. She had her gnarled walking stick in hand, though Philip doubted she needed it. He'd seen how quickly she moved on occasion. James was next to her, and he heard Philip and Eric coming because he turned away from the water to look at them. His scarred face held a trace of sadness, and Philip got worried. Someone pushed his inner panic button because he all but ran to the other. Alpha, is Sammy okay? Did something happen? Sammy was part of Helen, so maybe that's what Eric had meant when he'd spoken about her. If something had happened to his child while he wasn't there to protect him, then he was really going to go wild with grief. No, relax. He's okay. I left him with Corey. Philip released a breath of relief. He waited for his heart rate to get back to normal, and then he started to look over his surroundings. What is this all about then? James looked over at Eric. Ivan and Eric tell me that they'd been watching you lately. You're aware that they're sharing a body, right? Yeah, he was. This had been told to him a couple of times already. Eric was a ghost and Ivan was a medium who could see other ghosts, and sometimes they shared a body. He told as much to James so the man would know he was up to date on that story. Right, well. James seemed to look back at Eric for support. That wasn't normal. He was the pack alpha. Nothing should make him this unsure that he would need the help of another man to explain what was going on. Eric came up to stand beside him. Only when Philip looked at him, his eyes were the red color of a vampire. Back to Ivan it seemed. I have noticed something whenever I look at you. Even now I see it, and after walking in on you, I'm positive you are not aware of it. Ivan had purposely not mentioned Trevor's name, glancing over at James and old Maggie. He was attempting to be tactful, but James still caught it. What did you walk in on? The leading alpha was only curious, Philip told himself. Philip didn't have to answer, and if he said he'd rather not talk about it, James wouldn't reprimand him. He'd wanted to keep what he had with Trevor a secret at first, to keep people from thinking that Helen wasn't actually his mate and to protect her memory. Werewolves often waited for their mates because it was considered improper to wed anyone who was not a mate. Things like that only led to complications and cheating in the eyes of the wise men and women of each pack. But she was gone now, no matter what he did. He wasn't ready to move in with Trevor, but he didn't want to hide the man anymore either. He wasn't a disease. He walked in on Trevor and myself in his cottage. I'm sure he smelled what we'd been doing earlier. James's dark and crooked brows lifted. Oh, well, just do me a favor and don't let it go on too long. He's a young werewolf, and I don't want to see either of you getting hurt when he finds his mate. Philip wet his lips here. Time to confess something that no one in this group knew about. Trevor is my mate, James. Those dark brows went even higher into James's hairline. But I thought with Helen, he trailed off. There wasn't exactly a polite way to voice the questions that were no doubt going through his head. Oh shit, Ivan said. Helen and I were never mated. I loved her anyway and sometimes even managed to trick myself into thinking we were mated. We got married and told everyone in my pack that we were mated to make it official. I didn't want anyone questioning her authority or calling her a concubine, or questioning the rights his son had to leading the pack one day. Of course that was no longer the point, considering Phillip didn't have a pack anymore. He stared sharply. James, at this point, I'd like to keep it that way. You still want to keep this a secret? James asked. What I want is for no one to call my dead wife a whore because we weren't mated, Phillip said. He scratched his forehead with his thumb for the outburst, then addressed the alpha again. People are going to find out. Eventually. That's inevitable, and I don't mind that anymore. I just don't want this getting passed around until Trevor and I have come to a better understanding. Old Maggie frowned at him. Her response was the one that confused Phillip the most. Perhaps this is the true reason for her unrest. Watching a former loved one mate with another would be quite heartbreaking. Something inside of Phillip cracked when the old woman said that. What did you say? Really, he wanted her to repeat it, because it almost sounded like the wise woman was speaking about his wife in the present tense. This is why we brought you here. To explain what Eric and I've been seeing, Ivan said. Phillip remembered that the man was a medium, and he had the ability to see spirits. What have you been seeing? He asked, almost too afraid to hear the answer. Ivan led him over to the water. Phillip could vaguely recall being here once or twice before when he was still recovering. This would be the first time he was back here and was still of a sound mind. Ivan pointed to the water, and Phillip looked into the pool, noticing his reflection, Ivan's, James's, as well as old Maggie's still frowning face. There was another person there that he almost didn't see. He had to squint before the faded image became clear enough for him to recognize. He stumbled back when he recognized Helen's transparent face standing right next to him. He tripped over his own feet and fell onto his ass, but that didn't stop him from doing the backward crab walk just to get away from what he'd seen. Ivan stared down at him with a pitying expression. I figured you would be able to see her through the water. This is a spiritual place. Phillip shook his head. She couldn't have, she's a ghost? Ivan nodded. I'm sorry. I haven't really spent any time in your company before, so I never noticed her, but now I do see her. She's pretty much with you wherever you go. Why? What does it mean? Phillip asked. He finally managed to get to his feet and dust himself off. He looked around as though expecting to see her, but of course he couldn't. She was there. He couldn't see her, but she was there. She's haunting you because she's stuck here. We need to help her to cross over to the next life, or she'll become a violent spirit and never leave. Chapter 7. Phillip had wanted to walk back to the pack on his own after the news had been given to him. He needed a chance to think about what he'd just been told, and he replayed the conversation in his head. What's been keeping her here? Why can't she move on? Phillip had asked the medium vampire, a note of desperation in his voice. At first he'd assumed that it had something to do with Sammy, that perhaps Helen was worried for the safety of their son, and that it was an omen for terrible things to come. No, that hadn't been the answer he'd gotten at all. He had to run his hands over his face. What he'd heard had nearly made him sick. She's here because of you. She follows you wherever you go, so you are the cause. Something you're doing is chaining her here. He'd wanted to throw up at the thought of his deceased wife watching him having sex with Trevor. It must have shown on his face because old Maggie had commented on his green complexion. Perhaps we should bend him into the trees to keep him from vomiting in the pond. The spirits might not like that. There had only been one spirit in particular that Phillip had cared about, and he was torn between the urge to just shout out how sorry he was and at the same time start screaming out his defense. She was dead. Gone. He might still be feeling survivor's guilt, but he wasn't doing anything wrong by being with Trevor. The man was his mate, for God's sake. He liked Trevor. He hated that his wife was watching them while the two were being intimate, but how could her spirit blame him for following what nature wanted for him? There had to be something more to it. Helen wasn't the kind of woman who would do something like that, hold that kind of grudge. Phillip shivered as he walked back to the cottages, and the lights from the windows were soon visible in the distance. Trevor would be where those lights were. Would he be waiting up for him? Did Phillip even have the heart to go to him at this point? Phillip and Helen had spoken about what they would do if either of them ever found their true mate. In the beginning, whenever one of them wanted to have an adult conversation on the subject, it usually ended with someone crying, a lot of yelling, and getting a whole lot of nowhere on the subject. Then they'd started to make progress and they really learned how to speak to each other about what could possibly happen. Phillip had been hopeful. He'd thought that perhaps his mate would understand and be willing to share in some sort of polygamous relationship. There were some leading alphas who practiced that when they fell in love with people who weren't their mates after all. He didn't want to be a possessive jerk about it either, and though he hadn't been keen on the idea at the time, he'd even offered to share himself with whatever male Helen mated with as well. She'd been firmly against the idea until she became pregnant with Sammy. After that, it became a matter of protecting Sammy's right to inherit the pack, or, at the very least, not be seen as a lesser member because his parents had been going against the rules when they conceived him. Sons of concubines weren't exactly respected. That alone meant that it wasn't his relationship with Trevor that was causing her to haunt Phillip. Do you know? Can you tell me anything? Phillip had prompted and then explained what he and Helen had agreed to just to give the medium something to work with. Well, if it's not an issue of jealousy, then it's because you haven't let her go. What? Phillip had asked, frowning. Ivan had to explain further. If you're absolutely sure that it isn't the relationship itself that you've mated with Trevor, then it's because you're keeping her tied to you with your inability to let her go. You're the one who hasn't moved on yet. And just like that, Phillip had known the vampire had hit the nail on the head because he hadn't let her go. She was still in most of his thoughts. Every day. He struggled to keep her out of his head while he was inside of Trevor. It was him. He had to learn to let her go to set her free. He had to move on. Or else she would become a violent ghost, as Ivan explained it. She was doomed if she had to wait for Phillip to stop loving her. What an unfair thing to expect him to just switch off. It was incredibly selfish of him, but he went back to the house where he knew Trevor was waiting for him. The pull to his mate was strong, so strong that he couldn't ignore it. He needed comfort. He wanted to fight some hunters, but getting inside of his mate was just as appealing, even though in all probability they would just spend the night talking about what Phillip had learned. Just seeing Trevor would be enough to settle his inner demons for now. Still, his need for the touch of his mate and for that comfort he wanted so badly was so great that if Trevor so much as gave him any small hint, any subtle suggestion that he was desiring Phillip as well, Phillip would jump on the chance to take it. If not, well, the most he was willing to do was just be near him, maybe hold his hand, offer a chaste kiss. If Trevor didn't offer himself, Phillip wasn't going to ask, but if he did, Helen, I hope to God you've been closing your eyes and looking away because I can't keep away from him right now. Trevor jumped when he heard the door opening. He stood up from the couch and looked down the hall. Phillip sent him a limp wave. Hope you don't mind, he said, keeping his voice low and staying by the door. I didn't want to wake your roommates. Figured they'd be back by now. They had come back, and since it was late, they'd all promptly gone to their own bedrooms. Trevor was still airing his out, but he was pretty sure the others could still smell the sex that was lingering around his door. He'd bribed them to leave for a few hours. It didn't take a genius for figure out what he'd been doing. Yeah, they did. You can come in, you know, he said, waving Phillip over. Phillip took off his shoes like a good guest and walked over. The television in the sitting room was on but was silent as the infomercials ran on late night TV. What happened? Trevor asked when Phillip sat down next to him. The man clasped his hands together between his knees. He looked so worried. I think it was obvious that the vampire medium would have known about us after he walked in on us, but that wasn't why I came clean and told James and old Maggie about us. Trevor's eyes widened. You mean? They know we're mated, and I plan to let the pack know about it too. James has promised me that no one will so much as whisper anything negative about Helen. He knows many of the alphas and omegas personally, and I know some of them, but others are either new to this way or life or still have their thinking trapped in the old ways. Phillip took in a deep breath. I don't want to hide you. I might not be ready to fall in love with you, but it isn't right that I hide this from the others. Christ, it's only been a couple of days and I can't even keep to my own vow of silence. What about Sammy? Trevor asked. He didn't want to admit that he hadn't been entirely aware of the possibility of members of the pack speaking ill about Phillip's dead wife because they hadn't been mated. Now that he knew, he also wanted to know if this would impact that child. Since I'm no longer running a pack, it hardly matters if the alphas know he's not my real heir. Maybe he will be considered my true heir now that I'm mated to a man, and reproduction is sort of impossible at this point, Phillip said, with a crooked grin. Trevor returned that smile. Does it bother you at all that I'm a father? You're awfully young to be taking on the responsibilities of a child. I barely know how to care for him myself. Oh well. Trevor should have seen this question coming. He didn't know why he was unprepared for it. I never thought about it, to be honest. It doesn't scare you that I come with a baby? Eventually I'll learn how to take care of him, and he'll be living with me. Are you sure you want something more with me? More than sex to keep our inner wolves from going insane? Phillip's cheeks colored. Basically, yes. Trevor laced his fingers together between his knees, mirroring Phillip, and then he sighed. I'm going to be honest, I don't remember a lot about my life before leaving my parents' place. I know that I had parents and that I had siblings and that they were all younger than me. Things were rough sometimes. I know that. I guess the foggy memory is because I went partly wild too after I was transformed. Phillip smiled at him, no doubt thinking of his own hazy memories. It was another thing they had in common, Trevor realized. Despite that, I can remember certain little things. They're not clear, but they're there. Helping to make lunches in the morning, homework, and before that, yes, even diaper changes. Trevor made sure to look pointedly at Phillip. Kids don't scare me. Don't know if you've noticed, but I am sort of old enough to have them. Phillip nodded and blew out a long breath from his mouth. That wasn't exactly the reaction I'd hoped to get, Trevor admitted. Sorry, I guess I'm not done throwing things at you. Trevor frowned, trying to think about that one. What could be bigger than kids that would scare me away from you? I love you. Trevor wished Phillip wouldn't look so pained when he spoke those words. I know you do, and I like you a lot. And I'm okay with that for now, Trevor was quick to say. That pained look was still in Phillip's eyes when he looked at him. Trevor, Helen is haunting me. That's what the medium wanted to let me know. Trevor's insides froze. Are you serious? Does that sound like something I would joke about? No, of course not. I'm sorry. It's just that. Is she here right now? Trevor said, looking around and wondering if he would see a ghostly figure somewhere. Or if maybe the lights would start flickering or something. Most likely. Ivan and old Maggie think that I'm chaining her to me, that my inability to let her go is what's keeping her from moving on. Well, so far she hasn't hurt anyone, Trevor said. Phillip rubbed his face. By staying here, she's slowly going to start losing her mind, so to speak. She'll become a violent ghost. A lost spirit. She will start hurting people if I can't let her go. Trevor's heart sank. His hope for the coming future he might have with Phillip was looking more and more grim. You can't exactly turn the switch off of love, either. Can you? Not a question. Even he knew that was true. Phillip looked at him sharply. That's what I thought while coming here. What will you do? Trevor asked. He reached his hand across the couch cushions and Phillip's leg and curled his fingers around Phillip's hand, hoping to offer some comfort. His hopes were dashed when Phillip pulled away from the touch. I don't know what to do just yet, but Trevor, I don't think you and I should be intimate for a while. Trevor's heart pumped hot and heavy into his ears. He could barely think past the noise. Why? That's not what I meant to say. Not really. I'm not going to cut us both off entirely from each other, and I don't want to be cruel here. We still need each other. I still need you, otherwise I wouldn't be here. Your inner wolf. And you will be just as hurt as I will if we avoid each other completely. What I'm suggesting is that we take it easy for a bit, and come together only when we absolutely need to. I don't really want my wife watching me in bed with another man. Anyone for that matter. I don't want to make her worse, but it will make me go a little crazy if I can't at least see you from time to time, even if we aren't having sex. Trevor wanted to argue that she had already seen them together if she had been haunting him. He wanted to say that maybe she was the reason for Philip's inability to move on and not the other way around. But then he would be placing blame on a dead woman and fighting with Philip about something that the man would never see Trevor's side on. Okay, he said, setting his mouth in a firm line and then biting down on his lips to keep himself from saying things that he shouldn't. Okay? Philip asked. Yes, it's okay, Trevor snapped, and he clenched his fist so tightly that his nails dug painfully into his palms. Trevor, You should go, Trevor said, glancing over his shoulder and then quickly looking away. I'm tired. I'm probably going to bed. More likely he was going to sneak out and go running in wolf form just to get away from the stress. He didn't want Philip knowing that, and he didn't want the man to follow him, or to look at his face and see how close Trevor was to crying. His eyes burned and his throat was closing. It hurt to breathe as the tightness inside just got worse and worse with each second Philip stared at his back. He finally heard the ease of the springs and cushions of the couch as Philip got to his feet. Leave. Please leave. Philip must have finally turned on his heel, because then his footsteps sounded as he walked down the hall toward the door, collected his shoes, and then he was gone. The first thing Trevor did was release a sigh as the door closed. He stood there for a minute longer, letting the tense muscles in his body relax. It was harder than it should have been, and his body was still twitchy afterward. He walked to his room. He was more than certain that none of his roommates had heard his conversation with Philip. He could hear nothing but silence from within each room he passed. Yeah, definitely asleep. They weren't waiting up for anyone. Trevor wished he hadn't waited up at all. The man might not want to hide what they were anymore, but he wanted to avoid him now. It was like one step forward and two steps back. He fought the urge to slam the door to his room like a child, but when he was alone in there, he did finally let go and allow his tears to fall. Not like there was anyone watching. No reason to hide it. Then he spotted the book lying on his bed. Dracula. In a fit of blind rage, Trevor grabbed it and hurled it against his wall. He didn't care anymore if he was acting like a child, and he didn't care if he woke anyone up. He threw the novel with such a force that it put a hole in the drywall before bouncing out and falling to the floor. He immediately regretted what he'd done when several torn pages floated down, slower than the book itself. It made him want to cry even harder as he bent down to clean up his mess. Chapter 9. Philip spoke with James quickly before they all had shifted back into wolves to patrol the woods. Philip would be brought on alpha duties, pulling his weight with the pack, and he was going to hand his allegiance over to the man. Might as well make it official. He had been living on the land for over a month now. The only thing James wouldn't do for him was give him the same patrolling shifts that Trevor had. They could go out on the same hours, but neither would be allowed to work together. Trevor looked as though he was about to protest, but Philip took him by the hand and squeezed. They both looked at each other, and without words or even using their mental connection, Philip had been able to tell him not to ask. They would discuss it later. Trevor closed his mouth and let it go. Philip understood James's decision. As a former leading alpha, he'd had his pack running under similar rules before as well. Working so closely to a mate in potentially dangerous situations might seem ideal. After all, who better to watch one's back than a mate? The problem was that mates could become careless with each other. They lost their focus when they believed each other to be in danger, and they stopped thinking properly. No, this way was better. All three men were now in wolf form, and since they could find nothing and the sun was starting to set, they decided to head back. James's wolf grumbled something to Trevor, because Philip still couldn't listen in on James's inner thoughts. Trevor had to translate for him. I'll be going out with Nick tomorrow, and James will be with you. The wind's funny today, so we're not going to stop looking until we're sure there's no threat. Philip looked up at the sky. The wind had been picking up, and now gray clouds were starting to darken the already navy blue of the coming night. The scent of rain was in the air, and Philip had a bad feeling weighing him down. Then something in the air shifted, and there was the crack of a twig in the distance. He stopped and immediately spun around. A shrub moved in the distance, as though by the wind or something having run past its branches. What is it? Trevor asked, looking up at him and then down at the now still shrub several yards away. James also stopped and came over to see what the holdup was. I think something's there, Phillip said, taking a step forward. He carefully sniffed the air, searching for whatever it was that was following them. James and Trevor both did the same just in case, but it was Phillip who noticed it first, and he took a shocked step back. Phil. He shook his head. Hazy memories assaulted him from weeks before when he'd still been wild, and every waking moment had only been a terrible dream that needed to be overcome. There was something familiar in the scent that came to his snout, something that made flashes of angry eyes and sharp teeth pass right before his eyes. When he opened them again, he was on the ground, his head in Trevor's human lap. Trevor was speaking to him, but the words came out as though through a tunnel that was very far away. His face was worried, and he was petting Phillip's ears and face, attempting to rouse him. Did he actually faint? Christ almighty! And in front of his mate and James, too, all the while he was still trying to convince James that he was capable of coming on rotation. I'm fine, Phillip said through their link, and he managed to get back onto his paws, though he wobbled. Trevor smiled in apparent relief. Thank God, he said, still holding onto Phillip's face, petting his ears and pressing their foreheads together. What happened? Phillip didn't know what happened. He was about to say as much when he caught sight of the large pair of glowing eyes down the path the three of them had just come from. Phillip looked into them and couldn't bring himself to look away. They drew him in, hypnotizing him like a moth to a bright light. He snapped out of it in time to also take note of the size of the animal. Was at least 2 to 3 times the size of an alpha, and the curled-up black lips revealed fangs that dripped long ropes of drool. A piece of the right ear was missing, and the hackles on the enormous white wolf were raised, and he was crouched low to the ground, about to spring. Phillip's fall must have distracted Trevor and James, because they only looked up and realized that the giant wolf was there as Phillip stared at it. It was the man that Phillip had accidentally infected while he'd been wild. Luke, if he remembered the name right. When he'd rescued that hunter, Everett King, and his mate Cole Dane a little over 4 weeks ago, Luke had been one of the hunters that Phillip had taken out. Phillip had attacked the hunters that had captured the pair and were torturing Cole in front of Everett. He'd killed all but this one, leaving him for dead. That had been a huge mistake, because Phillip had transformed him, and clearly being transformed by a wild werewolf had some side effects, because Luke was enormous. Trevor quickly got to his feet, and James growled back at the large wolf as it placed one paw in front of the other. The wolf lunged. No, James couldn't fight a monster like that on his own, and Trevor was as good as dead until he could get into wolf form and have the chance to fight back. Phillip sprung ahead, lunging past James and toward the large wolf. No! Trevor yelled. Phillip clashed with the wolf in midair as they both jumped at each other. He was strong. It was like crashing into an oncoming bus that didn't bother to stop out of courtesy to the animal it just struck at 100 miles an hour. Luke was all teeth and claws and growling rage, and now Phillip was practically in the jaws of the creature. At least now they all knew what the hunters were looking for. They must have tracked Luke here. No one had expected the wild werewolf to come sniffing around DeWitts' pack. They knew better on that part now. Phillip was being torn apart like a dog's chew toy. The burning pain he felt all over his body eventually left him, and he allowed his body to go limp in Luke's mouth. He wasn't ready to die, and he still wanted to at least get some good bites in so that Trevor and James could have the head start they needed to get back to the pack and warn everyone that this out-of-control monster was coming. When his body sagged, the shaking stopped. Still felt like there was some severe rattling going on inside of his skull, and when Luke dropped him out of his mouth, the world beneath him swirled sickeningly. Trevor's desperate screams broke through the pain and dizziness he felt. No! Get away from him! No! The idiot was supposed to make the shift and run for his life, not stand there while Phillip was getting his ass handed to him. He didn't dare look over at his mate, but from what he could hear, James was growling at the man, probably sending him some mental commands preventing him from jumping into the fight. Trevor would do that if his leading alpha wasn't pulling rank on him. Phillip felt Luke's huge nose come down, and the warm breath he felt against his face, followed by the rush of cold air, let him know that his scent was being checked for death. Might as well make his move now then. Phillip opened his mouth and launched himself upright. Luke jerked back in surprise, but he wasn't fast enough to avoid getting his other ear caught between Phillip's teeth. He bit down hard, tearing through the skin, and Luke released a loud and pain-filled howl right before he started viciously shaking his head around and his body trying to force Phillip off of him. Phillip locked his jaws. He wouldn't let this wild animal anywhere near Trevor or the pack or his son. If Luke wanted revenge for being transformed into a wild werewolf, he was going to have to work for it. Finally, Luke managed to shake him off. Phillip's body was hurled into a tree, and he released a yelp as his back made contact. He thought he heard a pop in his spine, but as he was able to shakily get to his feet, he knew nothing had been broken. The wolf lunged for him again. Phillip used everything he had, all the energy left in his body, to jump out of the way. Luke as a wolf was so powerful that he crashed right through the tree, breaking it at the base with the kind of snap that reminded Phillip of a hunter's gun. The wolf spun around, spitting out long splinters from between its massive teeth that were 4 times the size of the ones in Phillip's mouth. "I'm going to kill you," Phillip heard inside of his mind. "Then I'm going to kill that boy who was fucking you." Phillip froze at both the voice he heard as well as the threat. "We can communicate like this?" "How?" Phillip demanded. The white hackles on top of the wolf's back rose up higher, until they were practically standing on end. "How the hell should I know that? I'm a hunter, not a werewolf. When I kill you, my curse will be broken." He actually thought that all he had to do was kill the wolf to cure himself. Some hunters still thought that. They believed it because of what they'd seen in the movies, so it wasn't like he could entirely blame the man for being wrong. It wasn't like it was his fault that he'd been doing his research in all the wrong places. Phillip managed to quickly glance behind him before putting his eyes back onto the threat at hand. Trevor and James were both gone. That was good. He didn't want them here to see him get killed. Phillip was willing to bet that the only reason James had been able to get Trevor to follow his orders to get out of there was because Trevor had seen Phillip get back up. Phillip was an alpha. He would handle this. "There is no cure for you, liar. Killing the one to infect you for a cure is just a myth, and it makes no sense anyway. Why would my death reverse the effects of the lycanthrope venom that I put into your body?" Luke made another swipe at him, and his angry growl showed off his powerful teeth, and Phillip's wounds ached as he looked at them. Christ, he was surprised the wolf hadn't bitten him in half. Then wait, Phillip was the one to transform him. Unintentionally, sure, but he was still this wolf's creator. It was hard as hell, and every inch of him ached, but Phillip stood straight. He raised his head and showed off his teeth to the other wolf. "You will stand down." Luke actually paused in his next step forward. "What? I am your alpha, and you are not going to attack me. You will stand down right now." Phillip approached the other werewolf, all the while keeping his hackles raised. Luke took a step back, his angry and snarling face suddenly unsure. Then the anger returned to his eyes, and his lips pulled back up as he began advancing. Once more. Just in case it was a strange game of chicken, Phillip didn't back down. "Stop. I said stop." Luke didn't respond this time or give any indication that he'd heard what Phillip had said. The connection was broken. Almost as soon as Phillip realized it was there, it was gone. Of course, Luke was an alpha, and an enormous one at that. It would be easy for him to break away from the instinctual command he felt for the other alpha that created him, especially with the blood dripping down Phillip's paws. He saw no other option. He ran for his life. Luke howled and gave chase. Phillip did not look behind him as he went, stretching and pushing his broken and wounded muscles as hard as he could. His paws beat against the ground as the sounds of snapping trees echoed behind him. Luke was like a bulldozer with rocket packs. He was fast and he was powerful. And this time he wasn't about to let Phillip live. Lead him away. Get him away from the pack, Phillip thought as he made a sharp turn around a group of large rocks. That did nothing to gain him some ground on the giant wolf. If anything, it got closer. The sounds of Luke's breathing and the rumble in the ground as his paws pounded the earth behind Phillip let him know that his end was nearly here. He wasn't going to be able to outrun the monster behind him. He was too injured and slow, and despite the many trees that Luke ran into and broke, they hardly did a thing to slow him down. Snapping teeth caught hold of his tail, and Phillip yelped at the pain that lanced up his spine. A stroke of luck and Luke stumbled on something. A dip in the ground, maybe, but he opened his jaws in shock and released Phillip before he could bite the tail off. He kept on running, and Luke righted himself and followed eagerly. Images of Sammy flashed through his mind. He was going to miss his son's first birthday because he was going to die. He would have a birthday if Phillip could just get Luke away from the pack. He had to distract the wild wolf long enough for Trevor and James to gather every spare alpha they had to fight. Sammy would survive. Trevor would too. Trevor. The pounding against the ground suddenly stopped. Phillip had been so focused on running that he hardly noticed at first, and he was at least 50 feet away before he managed to make himself stop. His wounds caught up with him, and his stop was more of a stumble, a fall, and a roll on the ground before his body finally skidded to a halt. He pushed himself up with a groan, curious as to why the giant wolf had stopped busting down birch trees and young pines in an attempt to eat him. Luke was looking down at Phillip. His giant mouth wasn't even open and panting from the run. Phillip's tongue was out and his lungs and throat burned as he tried to cool himself off. He'd been running on fumes just then. If Luke decided to stop playing whatever game he was on, Phillip didn't know how much farther he'd be able to run. Suddenly, the larger wolf turned his head and looked behind him at the trail of broken trees he'd left behind. Then his glowing gold eyes turned back to Phillip. Phillip had never seen a more sinister smile on a wolf's mouth than he did. Just then, Luke bent his head, eyelids going to half-mast, and what kind of looked like a smirk pulling up the one side of his mouth, revealing those sharp teeth. No, he knew. He'd figured out that Phillip had been leading him away. Phillip scrambled to all fours and then cried out when he fell back on his stomach. Luke released a disgusted snort, and then turned and ran back to the direction of DeWitts' pack. No, Sammy. Trevor. Using his claws and scratching up dirt in the process, Phillip pulled himself back to his paws. He forced his legs to obey him, and he pushed the pain and blood from his mind as he shot after the large wolf with more speed than he'd had when he was running for his life. Luke stayed ahead of him. Phillip didn't know what he was going to do if he somehow miraculously managed to catch him, but he had to keep going, even if his last act was to catch up to the wolf just to claw out one of his eyes. Well, at least he would help to weaken him and to give the other alphas more of a fighting chance when the battle for their lives came. He had to get to him. He couldn't let him hurt his family just to get back at him. He wouldn't. They were nearly halfway back to the main area of the property, and Phillip was starting to fall behind. His paws were numb, and though he commanded his legs to move faster, to not stop, they were starting to disobey him. He was going to fall again. He was going to bleed to death right there on the ground, and Luke was going to attack the only two people in the world that Phillip loved. He felt his body start to give out. He felt himself falling. Luke fell first. Another ball of fur, dark black this time, flew on top of him, startling the larger wolf into falling and rolling. Phillip did the same before he could crash into the monster, though in retrospect that was probably a mistake since he wanted to catch up to the rogue werewolf. He couldn't even pick himself up off the ground. Dust flew everywhere from the two crashing shifters. It went into his eyes, ears, and even up his nose. He sneezed several times for that one. Even before the dust settled and his nose and eyes cleared up, he already knew who the mysterious wolf was that attacked Luke. When the flying dust cloud did finally settle, he was proven right, and his heart sank at the sight of his mate. His mate, who was an alpha, and a large alpha at that, looked like nothing more than a skinny omega next to Luke's massive power. Trevor was snarling at the larger shifter, his teeth bared and hackles raised, as he stood in the way of the path leading back to the pack. No, you'll die, Phillip tried to say through their link. He wasn't even sure if the message made it to his lover, because Trevor didn't so much as flinch or look over at him. Maybe it was because he was too busy growling and circling the dangerous wolf in front of him. That had to be it, because as Trevor barked and bared his teeth at Luke, Phillip could hear the thoughts in his head. They were thoughts that Luke wouldn't be privy to, but Phillip still got them loud and clear. Kill you. I'll fucking kill you if you go near that kid. He was talking about Sammy, Phillip realized. Trevor was focused on protecting Phillip's child. He wasn't even thinking about the pack. Only then did their eyes meet, and Phillip knew that Trevor had heard his earlier command. He was ignoring it, and he was going to die for it. Luke barked back at Trevor as though he had heard the nasty threats going through the smaller wolf's head. Trevor was forced to take a step back as Luke advanced. Phillip fought and struggled to put himself back on all fours, but his bones felt liquefied. He could hardly control the shaking in his body or stay upright. Trevor, run back to the pack. Take Sammy and get out of here. I'll distract him, Phillip commanded. No, Trevor replied, again not looking at him as he faced down the threat before him. I won't let him kill you. But what was Phillip supposed to do if Luke killed Trevor? His guts sailed up into his throat as he watched the two charge each other. Luke's mouth opened, and Phillip was faced with the horror that he was about to watch his mate, no, the man he loved, get scooped up by those teeth and eaten. Phillip released a loud cry. No. Trevor fell onto his stomach and slid beneath the giant wolf that charged him. Just as Luke's teeth came down and missed, Trevor used his claws and managed to turn himself around, and in a motion so quick that Phillip nearly missed it, he leapt on top of Luke's back, then jumped up to his neck and started biting down on his face and what was left of his ears. Luke howled and bucked, but Trevor somehow managed to keep a firm grip on him, and wouldn't be shaken off so easily, or at all. He seemed to be doing just fine, and Phillip even allowed himself to hope that Trevor might be able to take out the larger wolf's eyes and bring him down. Helpless, easy to take out. Luke seemed to get smart just as Trevor climbed farther up, nearer to his eyes. Phillip's heart stopped as he watched Luke reel back, throwing his entire head back and then slamming his body against the ground, and Trevor's with it. Phillip howled and shot forward, as quickly as he could go as he watched Trevor's wolf form hold on for the first smashing against the ground, and then let go limply at the second, and then not move at all to defend himself or even try to get to safety when Luke did it a third time. Phillip managed to half crawl and half run over to Luke before the behemoth of a wolf noticed that his attacker was down and wasn't getting back up. Luke's tail thrashed wildly, and Phillip bit down hard, his teeth somehow making it past all the fur and catching the long tube of flesh and bone beneath. Luke reeled up again, but this time he howled in pain right before Phillip went on the ride of his life. He'd never ridden a bull before, or even been on one of those machines that made him feel like he was on that animal, but he imagined this was what it felt like. The world swirled around him, he couldn't focus on anything but just keeping his teeth locked down, and as everything spun, his body started to react. He became nauseous and dizzy. It was almost like he was on a ride in a carnival, only this wasn't fun. At least he'd managed to take Luke's attention away from Trevor. Phillip only wished he could look down and see if the man was all right, breathing, alive, anything, but he still couldn't focus on anything. He didn't realize it when it happened, but when his body slammed into the heavy base of a pine tree and then fell through the prickly branches, he knew something had given out. There was still fur in his mouth, and the taste of blood on his tongue, but it took him a second to realize that there was nothing else under his clenched jaws. The skin and fur must have torn off, and with all the struggling and spinning, Phillip had slid completely off the tail he'd been biting onto. He felt the vibrations on the ground as Luke approached him, but the earth spun beneath him, and he couldn't so much as tell from which direction the other wolf was coming. Trevor. He tried to locate his mate. He tried to seek him out with his nose and eyes, but everything was off kilter. He couldn't find Trevor, and he still didn't know if the other wolf was alive. Trevor wasn't answering his mental call. Warm breath that smelled of blood and filth wafted hard and heavy over his body. His vision was blurred, but even he recognized that there was a giant mouth breathing down on him. A big wet something splashed over his fur. Christ, Luke was drooling over him. He was actually going to eat him. Trevor. There was a growl, and Phillip felt the pull of those giant wolf lips around his body when they were suddenly and without warning yanked away. He managed to open his eyes. They were heavy like there were small rocks taped to his lids, but he got them open and managed to focus past all the swirling. There were no less than 10 other alphas on top of Luke. Some were in human form and most in their wolf forms. Phillip recognized each and every one of them from DeWitts' pack, as well as a few of the members formerly belonging to his own. Come on. Let's get you out of here, someone said above him. 2 pairs of human hands worked their way under his body and started lifting him. He recognized the scent and wanted to groan. The hunters. The former hunters at any rate. Isaac Foster and Everett King. Phillip had helped to save Everett's life not too long ago, and though he wanted nothing in return from a man who used to kill werewolves, it seemed now the debt was finally going to be paid for him. As for Isaac, well, Phillip would now owe him a personal debt of his own. Phillip was in debt to one former hunter, and was going to have to start treating another with at least some measure of respect. Perhaps both of them. That was going to be hard to swallow once he was able to get his throat working. Can you get into human form? This might be easier, Isaac said. That was right. Phillip was beyond the ability to fight. There would be no more battles for him today, or even within the next month. He managed to lift his head, and he saw the way Luke was being handled. The alphas still in their wolf forms were biting at Luke's legs and paws and what remained of his tail. The ones in their human forms had climbed on top of his back with much more ease than Trevor had done earlier, and they were attacking Luke's weak points with a ferociousness that he did not want to see. He looked over for Trevor, and his heart squeezed when he did not see the bleeding black wolf lying where Phillip had last spotted him. Perhaps he'd managed to get up and walk away while the alphas made Luke go completely insane with rage. He would have to get to a safe place like the way Isaac and Everett had dragged Phillip away as Luke spun and snarled and kicked out, destroying many more trees in the circle he created for himself. Phillip concentrated. He wasn't going to be fast in wolf form, so at least if he put himself on 2 feet, it would be easier for the men above him to help him to Trevor. The transformation was fast, surprisingly. Despite his injuries, he was naked and in human male form once more. Isaac looked down at him and hissed, "Fuck, that wolf use you as a chew toy? Or what?" Everett clenched his neck and hissed as well, "You're lucky you're not dead." Then the former hunter looked over to where the many alphas were subduing their giant rogue wolf, his eyes wide. "Cole," he whispered. Phillip didn't think the man had anything to worry about as far as his own mate was concerned. It looked pretty much like the alphas had everything under control. Luke was slowly tiring out, blood marred his white coat and he was going down. "Trevor," Phillip said. He couldn't sniff out his mate because of all the blood in his nose. Must have happened when he hit the tree. His nose wasn't exactly clogged with it to the point where he was pronouncing everything like he had a cold, but he still couldn't smell past it. "Where is Trevor?" "We'll take you to him. Come on," Isaac said, and Phillip thought he might owe the man again for how quickly they moved him around the wreckage that the alphas were creating. There was another group, a smaller one, all of whom were in human form, and to Philip's shock, some of them were even omegas. There was one man kneeling down by Trevor's side, comforting him by petting his coat, avoiding the bandages that had been placed and were being soaked through with blood. They surrounded him and touched him as one would a dying dog. They didn't expect him to survive. Phillip broke away from Isaac's hold him and all but burst through the small crowd that circled his mate. The omega to bandage and comfort Trevor had been the man with the multicolored eyes. One eye brown, the other blue. Chris. In werewolf lore, such eyes meant good luck. Maybe Chris been trying to give some of that luck to Trevor, hoping he would survive. "Give him to me," Phillip said, falling to his knees in front of the prone form. Trevor hardly had his mouth open and tongue lolling out, but as Phillip scooped his limp body into his arms, he had to admit that much of his own hope drained out of him. He gently shook the wolf body in his arms, then smoothed the fur around the eyes and snout. It was hard to tell because of the black fur, but it seemed that the blood was coating mostly everywhere on him, making him sticky and wet all over. "Trevor, I got you. I'm here. You're going to be okay."